He took off from Paris, heading for Seoul. But 174 minutes later, he found himself in the skies over Karelia, in the crosshairs of Soviet missiles. A passenger Boeing 707, not a spy plane, not a military aircraft, shot down in peacetime. Why? Hundreds of questions. 109 potential victims. And dozens of witnesses whose memories contradict the official version. We'll break it down minute by minute, how Flight 902 became part of a larger game, where lives were merely collateral damage. The sky above the Arctic wasn't black. It was bottomless. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing 707, Flight 902, a separate world existed, a hermetic cocoon of glowing green instruments, the quiet hum of 4 engines, and the smell of sterile, conditioned air. Beyond the windshield, there was nothing, no horizon, no clouds, only a distant, cold scattering of stars. Captain Kim Chang-kyu sat in the left seat with impeccable military posture. His gaze methodically scanned the instrument panel, altitude, speed, fuel, engine temperature. Every movement was refined by decades of discipline. He made a barely perceptible gesture, and within a minute, a flight attendant entered the cockpit carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Thank you, Yun-hee," he nodded, accepting his. Beside him, to the right, First Officer Kim Dong-wai looked younger and softer. His hands periodically adjusted his tie nervously. For him, flying over the pole was still an art bordering on magic. The first officer's voice cut through the monotonous engine hum, steady, but with a metallic note of anxiety that Kim Chang-kyu had learned to recognize over the years. "Captain, 2-degree deviation." Kim Chang-kyu's gaze darted from the main panel to the backup instruments. There, in the dim light, 2 different truths lived. The green, confident digits of the inertial navigation system showed a heading of 290. But nearby, in its analog housing, the needle of the old magnetic compass trembled but stubbornly pointed to 292. 2 degrees. Trivial for a tourist looking at a map. But here, at 10,000 meters altitude, this was a crack in the impeccable geometry of flight. The perfectionist inside Kim couldn't ignore it. His fingers, resting on the control column, tensed. He didn't answer Dong-wai. First, analysis. He flipped open the navigation clipboard mounted to the side. A thick stack of sheets covered with numbers and lines, his own work, performed with almost surgical precision in Anchorage. His gloved fingers slid along the coordinate line, then his gaze returned to the inertial navigation system display. The numbers matched. The system was doing exactly what he'd commanded it to do. Flawlessly. So where was this analog heresy coming from? A memory surfaced. A dusty lecture hall at the Flight Academy. Old instructor Choi, a Korean War veteran, rapping his knuckles on an enormous map of the Arctic. His raspy voice booming throughout the auditorium, "Remember this, pups. Here, at the top of the world, Earth's magnetic field goes crazy. The compass is a drunk. It'll lie to your face like an unfaithful wife. You can't trust it." Kim smirked at the memory. Old man Choi. How many times had he repeated that? He flicked a switch, increasing the backlight on the backup instruments. The compass needle was indeed behaving nervously, trembling slightly, as if uncertain of its choice. He'd seen this before on polar routes. Small, temporary deviations. Glitches in old equipment struggling against planetary physics. And beside it, the calm, unblinking digits of the inertial navigation system. The logic of gyroscopes and accelerometers, independent of the whims of the magnetic field. Technology he trusted. Technology that had never let him down. The choice was obvious. This wasn't a course error. This was the death throes of an obsolete instrument. Kim Chang-kyu leaned back in his seat. He'd made his decision. His job wasn't just to fly the plane, but to filter out false signals, separate panic from real threats. Right now, he saw exactly that, a false signal capable of sowing doubt in the young first officer. He reached out and confidently tapped his fingernail on the display glass. "This is our truth, Dong-wai," his voice sounded calm, with notes of fatherly instruction. "And this," he waved his hand toward the magnetic compass, "this is a ghost. Instructor Choi's memory. Up here, you can only trust the gyroscopes. 2 degrees, that's its death rattle. Don't pay attention to it." Kim Dong-wai looked at the commander's impenetrable face, then at the instruments, and slowly nodded. The captain's authority was absolute. If Kim said it was a glitch, then it was a glitch. Kim Chang-kyu took a sip of coffee. Control restored. Anomaly identified and dismissed. He'd trusted his experience. The plane's nose, invisible to him, was already pointing several hundred kilometers west of where it should be. Straight into the heart of the Soviet Arctic. Deep beneath the frozen earth of the Murmansk region, the air was thick with ozone and the smell of cheap cigarettes. In the dim command post of air defense, the only light came from green radar screens. Colonel General Pavel Lutsenko stood before a giant tactical map, his massive figure casting a shadow over the contours of the Kola Peninsula. A piercing electronic signal cut through the silence. A young officer jumped up. "Comrade Colonel General. Unidentified contact, Sector Alpha 7. Lutsenko took 2 steps toward the console. His eyes bore into the new glowing dot crawling from the direction of the pole. "Data," he barked. "Altitude 10,000. Speed approximately 900 kilometers per hour. Not responding to queries. Transponder silent." Lutsenko straightened. His face was stone. "Course deep into the territory. Not a civilian corridor. Reconnaissance plane. Provocateur. Doesn't matter. Protocol is clear. Launch interceptors from Africanda. 2 aircraft. Immediately." The deafening wail of a siren tore through the snowy airbase's night silence. Captain Alexander Bosov instantly bolted from his spot. 3 seconds to pull on his flight suit. Running across icy concrete to his Su-15. The roar of turbines that technicians were already spinning up. He raced up the metal ladder, each step echoing hollowly in the night silence. He dove into the cramped cockpit. The smell of ozone, cold metal, and kerosene hit his nose, a familiar smell. The captain collapsed into the seat, his fingers automatically finding the 5-point harness buckles. Click. Another one. He became one with the machine. His hand reached for the canopy. He lowered it. The heavy plexiglass descended with a dull, vacuum thump. The world outside disappeared. The blizzard, technicians' shouts, the siren's wail, all became a silent movie behind thick glass. The world narrowed to the red light of combat mode. The instruments on the panel blazed to life, bathing his face and hands in blood-red light. Numbers and scales glowed like runes. The silence in the cockpit became dense, tense. He heard only his own breathing in the oxygen mask and the hum of electronics. Static crackled in his helmet headphones. 1 second. 2. Then, a voice. Dry, devoid of emotion, as if machine-generated. 35, immediate takeoff. Target, unidentified violator. Mission, intercept, identify, force landing. 35, understood, he replied. His voice didn't waver. In that moment, he ceased being Alexander Bosov. He became 35. An instrument. He brought the engines to full power. The roar became a deafening scream. Vibration pierced his entire body. A 10-ton hammer pressed him into the seat. Liftoff. The ground vanished below. The Su-15, like a spear thrown by a god's hand, soared into the polar night. Now he wasn't a man. He was a weapon. Suddenly they materialized from the darkness. 2 swift silver silhouettes flashing past the Boeing's left wing. My God! First Officer Kim Dong-wai cried out. "Captain! Fighters!" Kim Chang-kyu spun around sharply. Two Su-15s took escort positions, their predatory forms with missiles under their wings clearly visible. Professor Robert Anderson didn't wake from sound. He woke from silence. Not from complete silence, but from a change in its tone. The monotonous, lulling hum of the engines he'd grown accustomed to over the past several hours suddenly became deeper, as if someone had added a low, anxious note to it. He opened his eyes. In the cabin's semi-darkness, nothing had changed. But the sense of unease wouldn't go away. The passenger in the row across, sitting by the window, wasn't asleep. He pressed his forehead against the cold plexiglass of the porthole, his posture unnaturally tense. His neighbor had also woken and was now reaching across him, trying to make something out. Anderson frowned. He removed his blanket, adjusted his thin-framed glasses, and leaned toward his window. The first thing he saw was the unearthly, ghostly canvas of the northern lights. But now there was something new in this dance. Two shadows. They moved parallel to the plane, slightly above and to the sides. These were machines. Angular, predatory, with needle-sharp noses. The silver metal of their fuselages dully reflected the polar lights. They flew so close that Anderson could distinguish the red stars on their tails. Fighters. The thought wasn't a word but a cold stab in his chest. Soviet fighters. His breath caught in his throat. He felt a chill run down his spine. His heart, until then beating steadily and sleepily, suddenly stumbled and began pounding faster, echoing loudly in his ears. He looked around. Anxiety was no longer just a feeling. It had become a sound. A quiet, serpentine whisper began spreading through the cabin. People were waking, rousing each other. "What is it?" a woman behind him whispered. "Look, at the window. Are those military?" A young Korean mother instinctively held her sleeping infant closer. The atmosphere in the cabin changed within seconds. The cozy, safe cocoon transformed into a trap. Sleepy calm gave way to sticky, suffocating tension. The air became dense, electrified. Anderson, a historian, a specialist in the Cold War, felt not like a passenger but like a character in one of his own lectures. He understood that their routine journey had ended. History had begun. Kim grabbed the microphone, switched to emergency frequency 121.5 MHz. Unidentified military aircraft, this is Korean Air Flight 902, civilian airliner. Static and unintelligible Russian speech came from the speakers. In his cockpit, Bosov executed standard procedure. He brought the fighter forward and sharply rocked his wings, the universal sign for, "Follow me." Then flashed his landing lights. No reaction. To Kim, these maneuvers looked like an aggressive show of force, not an order. Misunderstanding grew, transforming into fear. In the bunker, Lutsenko's face hardened. Target not responding. This is insubordination. His voice in Bosov's headphones sounded like a verdict, 35, authorizing warning fire. Tracers. Across the nose. Bosov pressed the trigger without hesitation. The Boeing's cockpit was pierced by blinding flashes. Incandescent orange streaks stitched through the darkness right in front of the windshield. The roar of gunfire was audible even through the fuselage. Fireworks. Kim Dong-wai screamed hysterically. But Kim Chang-kyu froze, his face deathly pale. He couldn't believe they were firing on a civilian aircraft. Panic erupted in the cabin. The flight had become a nightmare. In the underground bunker, time was measured not in hours but in reports. The operator's voice was tense, "Comrade Colonel General, violator not reacting to warning fire, continuing movement deep into territory." General Lutsenko stared at the red dot crawling across the map. To him, this wasn't misunderstanding. This was arrogance. Proof of hostile intentions. He lifted the high-frequency line to Moscow. His voice was firm as granite, requesting authorization to use weapons for destruction. The pause stretched into eternity. Finally, from the speaker came a metallic, emotionless response, authorization granted. Lutsenko hung up. Turned to the communications officer. 2 words, pronounced like a hammer blow, destroy target. The order reached Captain Alexander Bosov as he flew 100 meters from the huge airliner. 35, authorization to use weapons granted. Destroy target. Bosov froze. His gaze was riveted to rows of illuminated portholes. Warm, yellow light, behind which shadows of people could be glimpsed. This wasn't a bomber. Not a reconnaissance plane. A thought flashed through his brain, sharp as a glass shard, civilian. 1 second of internal paralysis. Then years of training and absolute faith in orders took over. If an order's been given, it means they know more up there. His job isn't to think. His job is to execute. 35, task understood, his own voice sounded in his headphones alien and level. He pulled the fighter back and down, taking position for attack. Movements precise, practiced to automatism. In the gun sight on the windshield appeared the Boeing silhouette, enormous, defenseless. His finger rested on the red launch button. He exhaled and pressed. 1 R-60 missile with heat-seeking warhead tore from the pylon, leaving a white contrail behind. The missile found the hottest point, the working engine. The explosion occurred at the left wing. Not a fireball like in movies, but a sharp, blinding strike, like a lightning discharge. Hundreds of incandescent fragments pierced the skin, tearing fuel and hydraulic lines. Part of the wing, several meters long, simply tore off and disappeared into darkness. The plane shuddered like a living creature receiving a mortal wound. On the instrument panel in the cockpit, dozens of red warning indicators lit up simultaneously. The piercing wail of sirens mixed with screams from the passenger cabin. Instant depressurization. Air began rushing outward with a deafening roar. Oxygen masks dropped from ceiling panels. Having lost part of its left wing and thrust from 2 engines, the plane sharply banked left and plunged into a death dive. The altimeter spun wildly backward, 9,000 meters, 8,000, 7,000. The control column in Kim Chang-kyu's hands was tearing away, vibrating. Professional pride burned in the surge of adrenaline. Only a pilot remained, instinctively fighting for life. Left engines to idle. Right, to maximum, he roared. Kim Dong-wai, his face white, gripped the thrust control levers. Asymmetric thrust. The only chance to level the bank. Kim Chang-kyu threw his full weight onto the control column, trying to raise the nose. The metal hull groaned and creaked under inhuman load. At approximately 3,500 meters altitude, on the very edge of stalling into a spin, the Boeing's nose slowly, agonizingly slowly began to rise. They pulled out of the dive. But they continued falling. For Professor Robert Anderson, hell didn't begin with the explosion. The explosion was too quick, too abstract, a dull, visceral thud that passed through the plane's fuselage and struck his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Real hell began in the deafening silence that followed. Silence lasting 1 heartbeat before it was torn to shreds by a chorus of hundreds of human screams. The world tilted. Not smoothly, but sharply, violently, as if a giant hand had overturned their cozy world. Anderson felt the seatbelt dig into his pelvis, and gravity transformed from an abstract concept into a physical beast trying to rip him from his seat and hurl him at the ceiling. His tweed jacket, symbol of his calm academic life, suddenly weighed a ton. Beyond the porthole, the night's blackness and ghostly green aurora mixed into a nauseating, blurred vortex. He didn't see the ground. He saw the planet itself hurtling toward them at unimaginable speed. The cabin air became icy, searing. It tore from breaches in the fuselage with a piercing, soul-rending howl, the cry of a dying machine. Oxygen masks shot from ceiling panels with a hiss, dangling on their thin hoses like hanged ghosts. Around him was pure panic, a man in the adjacent row thrashing in hysteria, a woman across silently weeping, pressing her child's head to herself. From opened overhead bins, belongings rained down, clothing, books, souvenirs, meaningless trash on the threshold of eternity. Anderson's knuckles whitened, gripping the armrests. He was a historian. He'd read about this. But this wasn't a book. The screams were real. The cold searing his lungs was real. It was then, in this chaos, that his gaze caught movement in the aisle. It was one of the flight attendants. A young woman whose name he'd forgotten. Her impeccable uniform was rumpled, a dark bruise on her cheek. She wasn't walking. Walking was impossible. She was crawling. Clinging to seat legs, bloodying her knuckles, she moved against the slope that pulled everything down toward inevitable death. In her eyes burned not panic but desperate, almost insane determination. Her goal, an elderly woman several rows ahead. The old woman was frantically fumbling with an oxygen mask, her trembling hands unable to pull the elastic band over her head. She was suffocating. The flight attendant reached her. She embraced her, pressed her to herself, protecting from falling debris, and her nimble, trained fingers secured the mask on the woman's face in a second. Anderson watched, holding his breath. He forgot his own fear. Forgot the ground rushing to meet them. He, a man who'd spent his life studying the great deeds of the past, witnessed a quiet, anonymous act of the greatest courage. Here, in this hell of tearing metal and human despair, one soul refused to surrender. He decided to meet the end not as a victim but as a witness. Kim Chang-kyu frantically peered downward. Through breaks in the clouds, the endless dark carpet of Karelian taiga. Death. And suddenly, a saving gleam. A huge frozen lake. The only chance. Prepare for emergency landing. Belly landing. His voice broke, but the command was clear. Over internal communications, he transmitted the order to the flight attendants. Screams rang out in the cabin, head between knees. Arms around head. The Boeing, flying at approximately 300 kilometers per hour, first caught the tops of pines at the lake's edge with its left, mangled wing. The soul-rending screech of metal on wood. The impact killed some of the speed, but the plane crashed onto the ice with a roar. The ice held. The machine weighing dozens of tons slid across the surface, throwing up showers of sparks. It spun, the nearly severed wing caught on a pressure ridge and tore off completely with a crack. Having traveled almost a kilometer, the battered fuselage came to rest 50 meters from shore. An unnatural, deafening silence descended. Gray dawn over the frozen lake brought not hope but a low, growing rumble. 3 heavy Mi-8 helicopters with red stars on their sides hovered over the battered Boeing, raising whirlwinds of snow dust. Soldiers in winter uniforms poured from opened hatches. They didn't run to the plane with stretchers. They spread out in a line, surrounding the fuselage. Rifle barrels were aimed at the portholes. From the cockpit, staggering, Captain Kim Chang-kyu emerged. Behind him, the first officer. They descended the emergency ladder to the ice and raised their hands. These weren't rescuers. This was a convoy. Passengers were let out one by one. The wounded were silently loaded into one of the helicopters. The rest were led at gunpoint to shore, where military all-terrain vehicles awaited them. The convoy of vehicles brought them to the snow-covered village of Kestinjie. People were housed in a 2-story building of the village school, smelling of chalk and mustiness. Professor Robert Anderson, along with the other passengers, was locked in the assembly hall. He tried to address the young soldier at the door. "Excuse me, can you tell us where we are?" The soldier grimly looked at him and turned away, gripping his rifle tighter. Captain Kim Chang-kyu and First Officer Kim Dong-wai were separated from everyone. Kim was led into an empty classroom on the second floor and locked in. An hour later, the door opened. A man in a nondescript gray suit with colorless eyes entered. Major Volkov. Committee for State Security, he introduced himself in broken English. Let's talk about your reconnaissance mission, Captain. It was a navigation system malfunction, Kim answered firmly. He still clung to this version. Admitting equipment failure was easier than admitting his mistake. Malfunction, Volkov smirked. Interesting version. We'll check it. The interrogation continued for hours. Volkov pressed, drew flight diagrams over military installations, accused him of espionage. Kim stood his ground, equipment failure. At Afrikanda Air Base, Captain Alexander Bosov sat in the smoking room. He'd just submitted his report. Another pilot approached and slapped him on the shoulder. Good work, Sasha. Shot down a CIA spy. Bosov slowly raised his heavy gaze to him. There were passenger windows, he said quietly. Who knows what they paint on their spy planes, the colleague waved dismissively and left. Bosov remained alone. He remembered that warm, yellow light from the portholes. In the sterile office of the USSR Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a Soviet diplomat read a note to a United States representative serving as intermediary. Rescue operation expenses amount to $100,000. We expect compensation before releasing the detainees. Minister Park Jong-soo, South Korean representative, listened to the translation with a stone face. We demand immediate release of our citizens. Your fighters attacked a civilian aircraft. This is an act of aggression. Your plane grossly violated our border. We had the right to defend ourselves. The bargaining began. 109 human lives became bargaining chips in a big political game. On the second day of interrogation, Volkov's tactics changed. He brought a large aviation map and spread it on the table. Fine, Captain. Let's assume malfunction. Show me. How could a professional with your experience, Volkov glanced at his notes, 12 years in the Air Force, allow such a deviation from a simple failure? Your route deviated thousands of kilometers. Explain this to me from a technical standpoint. He placed a pencil in Kim's hand. Kim froze. He looked at the map, and icy horror began rising in his throat. He understood that any attempt to explain this as equipment failure would look like an amateur's lie. In a secret laboratory under Moscow, an engineer in headphones listened to recordings from the black box. He heard Captain Kim's calm, confident voice, "This is a ghost. Instructor Choi's memory. Up here, you can only trust the gyroscopes." The engineer stopped the tape. Removed his headphones. Looked at his colleague, an air defense colonel. He consciously ignored the magnetic compass readings. He was confident in the inertial navigation system. The colonel nodded grimly. So not malfunction. So error. Prepare the report. Urgently. In the middle of interrogation, an officer entered the classroom and handed Volkov a sealed packet marked "Secret." Volkov opened it and began reading. Kim watched as the investigator's face didn't change, but his eyes became increasingly hard. Having finished reading, Volkov didn't show Kim the report. He placed it on the table and looked at the captain with a predatory smile. Your own recorders say you were flying the wrong way from the very beginning, Volkov began, enunciating each word. Your inertial system worked perfectly. It executed the program loaded into it. There was no failure. An incorrect program was entered. Confess, Captain. This wasn't malfunction. This was error. Your error. Volkov's words, backed by the invisible truth from the report, breached Kim's defense. Consciousness plunged into the past. Bright, tangible flashback, his finger in the cockpit in Anchorage rapidly tapping the inertial navigation system keyboard. On the map it says, W, West. But the finger, driven by muscle memory and fatigue, presses the adjacent key, E, East. A strangled moan escaped Kim's throat. He raised eyes full of tears to Volkov. I confused longitude. West with east. It was me. My mistake. He broke, expecting either condemnation or relief from confession. But Volkov reacted differently. He leaned back in his chair, his face becoming almost bored. Your truth is useless to anyone, Captain, he said calmly. A spy is a good enemy. A victim is good grounds for sanctions. But a pilot who confused East and West, that's just embarrassing. We won't tell anyone your story. And neither will you. Understood? Kim Chang-kyu looked at him, and the meaning slowly dawned. He'd just been sentenced. Not to execution. To lifelong silence. After the confession, silence in the room became heavy as a tombstone. Captain Kim Chang-kyu sat motionless, staring at his hands on the table. These hands that saved 109 lives had first put them on the brink of death. He no longer felt fear or anger. Only emptiness. Major Volkov stood and approached the window. He spoke without turning, his voice monotonous as a pathologist's lecture. So, truth established. Banal, human error. And now, Captain, forget it. Kim slowly raised his head. In a few hours, Volkov continued, diplomats in Moscow will reach agreement. Money will be paid. You and your passengers will be released. And you'll be assigned a new role. You're the hero who courageously landed a damaged plane. You're a victim of Soviet aggression. These are useful roles. Convenient. Your country will be proud of you. Americans will use you as proof of our cruelty. Everyone will be satisfied. He turned. In his colorless eyes was neither malice nor sympathy. Only statement of fact. Everyone except you. Your truth will remain here, in this room. In my report, which will lie in archives marked secret. And in your memory. That will be your punishment, Captain. Not prison. But the mask of a hero you'll wear until the end of your days. In the richly decorated office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a Soviet official and American mediator shook hands over the polished table. The sum of $100,000 will be accepted as compensation for the rescue operation and maintenance, the Soviet diplomat pronounced. Excellent, the American replied. And regarding the official cause of the incident in the joint communiqué? The Soviet official allowed himself a faint smile. We'll settle on vague wording. Navigational difficulties leading to unintentional violation of airspace. Without specifics. This will suit everyone. The deal was concluded. Truth was officially buried. When passengers in the school assembly hall were told they were flying home, joyful cries and tears of relief erupted. People embraced. But Professor Robert Anderson noticed a strange detail. The crew, Captain Kim, the first officer, and flight attendants, were led out separately. On their faces was no joy. Only infinite weariness and some gray shadow. He tried to approach the captain to shake his hand, to thank him. But a soldier politely but firmly blocked his path. Anderson stopped, following Kim's figure with his gaze, back straight as a rod. Something wasn't right. Heroes who saved everyone shouldn't look like the condemned. 2 days later. An airfield outside Moscow. Cold wind drove snow dust across concrete. At the ladder of an Aeroflot plane that was to take them to Helsinki, foreign journalists crowded. First they released the passengers. Camera flashes, shouts, commotion. Then the crew appeared. In the center, Captain Kim Chang-kyu. His uniform was cleaned and pressed. He walked with perfect military bearing. Reporters rushed toward him. Captain, was this a spy mission? How did you manage to land the plane? What do you think of the Soviet pilot's actions? Kim didn't look at them. His gaze was fixed straight ahead. At one moment, his path crossed with Professor Anderson's, who was waiting his turn to board. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Anderson's gaze was sharp, questioning. He wasn't asking, he knew the official version was a lie. In his eyes was not condemnation but a complex combination of curiosity and sympathy. Kim Chang-kyu didn't respond. His face was an impenetrable mask. He only barely perceptibly, almost imperceptibly, nodded. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement of a shared, unspoken truth. And then he turned away and began climbing the ladder. Each step echoed in his soul. He wasn't ascending to a plane. He was ascending his personal Golgotha. He would be celebrated as a hero, and this celebration would be eternal torture for him. The plane door slammed shut, cutting him off from the past. At snow-covered Afrikanda Air Base, Captain Bosov stared at the gray sky from which another fighter was departing. His face expressed nothing. He'd executed the order. For him, the story ended. In his office, General Lutsenko closed a thick folder labeled KAL 902 Incident. Stamped a large red seal on the cover, "To Archive." He put the folder in a safe and turned to the map, where there were no longer any extraneous red dots. The Aeroflot plane gained altitude and headed west, carrying 109 saved lives and one buried truth.